are seeing the light in front of me. I'm not going to shine the light.
The
You
light,
already have the light.
going straight up the heavens.
This light happens to be a chandelier that was in my parents' house. And we're talking about 50 years. So we brought it from Brooklyn when they came to this neighborhood, and we took it from that house to bring it here. Also, it fills a gap and a reminder of the kind of ore that they shed. So when we have a Shabbos table around this, we basically sit here on Shabbos. When we sit around the table, their presence is felt through the light. So it's very special to be able to stand up here, right in front of this light. I came across something in this week's Parsha. I want to tell you that my father passed away, Tes Teves. That was the week in which we read Vayigash. And the Parsha of Vayigash was sort of made, all of us are very excited about that Parsha. If you grow up with the story that goes on, nobody can help but be moved. But I was, especially the memory that everybody has, my memory is very, very deep. My father was a mechanech, was a teacher in Yeshiva High School in Montreal when I was a kid, 7, 8, 9, 10. And he used to have his Bacharim come on Friday night, and they would have some peanuts and some raisins, and he would talk about the Parsha. So I used to climb on his lap as an 8-year-old. I remember this really indelibly in my mind. And he would know how to tell the story. He was a very gentle, soft-spoken person, but somehow he knew how to tell a story in a very special way. And especially these few parshios that came to a climax when you come to Vayigash. And Yehuda gets up and he gives out that cry and offers himself in place of Binyamin. I always cried, and my two sisters cried. It was that was a bechiyah of reunion. And then, of course, amazingly, that was the parsha in which we had a bechiyah of separation when he passed away. So Vayigash is something I wanted to look at in preparation for this discussion, Le'iloi Nishmato. And we read that parsha this past Shabbos. And we remember that Yosef revealed himself to his brothers and asked them to bring his father Yaakov to Egypt. He pointed out that he should do that because there were 5 years left to the famine. And when there would be no sowing of seeds and no harvest, and he would be able to sustain the family. It was the Egypt. If they stayed in Canaan, it would be dangerous. So they brought him. Yaakov comes and he meets Paro for the first time. And the Parsha is very clear. When he first appears to enter Paro's chambers, he blesses him. Some words are exchanged. And then he leaves him and he blesses him again. The two brachos that he gave Paro. And there's a medrash that is brought by Rashi. What are these blessings that he gave him? So the first one was that he just greeted him, wished him well, whatever. Rashi sort of describes what could have been a greeting. The second one was something special. The second one was that he gave him a bracha that every time he would go to the Nile, to the Or, the waters would come up to meet him, to greet him. Now, since Mitzrayim is, the Medrash goes on to say, since Mitzrayim is fed by the waters of the Yeor, that's its survival basically is by the Yeor. So when he gave them that bracha, which was the second year of the famine, right? That ended the famine. So there's a Mechilta and there's a Medrash that says that Yaakov's blessing ended the famine. Proof of the pudding is that the Medrash brings the fact that, the Medrash, the Parsha later on discusses how the famine was conducted and what happened with the people of Mitzrayim when they were hungry. So it says basically that they spent the money, year one. Then they came to Yosef and they said, look, we have no more money and we're going to starve. What should we do? Take our cattle, our flocks. So all of that was given to Paro, and they ate in exchange for the flocks. At the end of that, all their flocks were gone at the end of a year, and it says, Bashana Shenit, the second year, they came and they said, we got nothing. We have absolutely nothing. Please, they pleaded with him, what are we going to do? So they said, we'll offer all our lands and ourselves as slaves to Paro so we won't starve. And they said something very strange. They said, give us some seeds so that the land would not be ruined. So Yosef gives them seeds. So Medrash points out that to sow seeds, he had said to his father, there are not going to be any more seeds and no sowing. Remember, that's why for 5 years that's not going to happen. So you see, according to the Medrash, that the famine, Davka, at that time, the second year, Shana Shenit, is when Yaakov came. And that's the time he gave the bracha to Paro. And that's the time the famine was over. And they were desperate because they hadn't brought any food out of the land yet. So Yosef gave them seeds, zera. Otherwise, if the famine was still going on, there's no point in giving zera because they wouldn't grow. Right? So the Medrash is satisfied with that proof. It so happens that the Ramban doesn't agree with this Medrash. He claims that, in fact, it's almost impossible that the money would run out in less than a year, that it probably lasted actually for 5 years. According to him, when we're talking about the money running out, the first year the money ran out is the year 6 in which they took all the cattle. Then they were all out through the cattle, and year 7 is Shana Hashenit, when they said at the end of that year they're taking, and then they got the seeds because 7 years were over, according to him. But he knows that the Chazal, the Chachamim say that Medrash, and he says, I want to tell you something interesting about that Medrash. The question really happens to be asked, what happened? Yaakov gave the blessing, let's say, and the famine is over. 2 years only. Let's say Ramban is ready, for sake of argument, to think about that. What happens when Yaakov passes away? Does the famine disappear forever because he gave the bracha, so it's over? Or does it return? So Rabbi Yossi happens to say that it came back. So long as the Chacham, as long as the Tzaddik is there and gives the bracha, good for the time that he's there. And after he passed away, there was famine again. So that we don't see the entire story, according to Rabbi Yossi, that yet is to come. And he proves it by saying that, you remember, after Yaakov died, Yosef said to his brothers, Al tirau, don't be afraid, I will sustain you. Ani akalkelchem, ani akalkeletchem. Now, he doesn't really have to sustain them with food unless it's a famine time and he is the boss of the treasury and he can give them food. They had flocks and they were out in Goshen. They could grow things on their own. So the Medrash tries to prove through that the famine returned after Yaakov died. And he was able to sustain his family through it. About this, Rabbi Yossi, there's a machlokas. Rabbi Shiur Rabbi Yehuda doesn't like it at all. And he says the following. He says, he rejects it, and he says the famine was canceled from his blessing and did not resume after he died. For, I'm translating, for it would not bring praise and honor to the Kadosh Baruch Hu that the words of a righteous man bring the blessing in his lifetime, and then the blessings are gone when he dies. A bracha is a bracha. The waters will rise to Paro's feet when he goes to the river. Kachazeh. However, the son of Rav Shiur Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Elazar, interestingly, he says, I do not agree with my father. I rather agree with Rabbi Yossi. And he said the following, for it is indeed greater praise and honor to the Kadosh Baruch Hu that so long as his righteous ones are in this world, blessing is present in the world. And when the righteous ones are gone and depart from the world, the blessing departs as well. That brings people awareness of what the bracha came from. So he thinks that that's the case. So the Ramban actually brings this machlokas, interestingly, even though he doesn't really subscribe to the notion of the Medrash. So I thought about this, and I wanted to connect it to the topic at hand, and I think I agree with Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yossi. Not that they need my agreement. And to assess to accept the view of Rav Shiur Rabbi Yehuda, it seems to me, we would have to believe that the blessing of a tzaddik is somehow talismanic. It's a magical spiritual power. It's a very popular notion today. He says something and that's it, right? And that's it. And that's Rav Shiur Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. And he certainly was extremely mystical and Kabbalistic, right? So he would consider this.
He gave a bracha to Paro.
Right, correct. And therefore it would have to last. Correct? That's what he says. And deriving spiritual qualities from the tzaddik, and that's it. Once given, the bracha would bear fruit and be permanent. Rabbi Yossi's opinion, obviously doesn't agree, is that a righteous man can have an impact on his environment. He can bring influence and example to the surroundings in which he lives. All who meet him can be transformed through the contact with the tzaddik, and the blessing their lives bring to their surroundings derive from that influence, not from his presence in some kind of talismanic way, but from his presence and his impact. If the influence, once the tzaddik dies, if the influence is maintained in the population in which he sojourned, then the blessing would remain. If they depart, leaving no lasting impact behind them, then in a way the tzaddik has failed in terms of his impact on his environment. And the blessings that they brought with them in their lifetime vanishes with them. Now Yaakov, it's a pretty interesting and obvious example if you take Rabbi Yossi's opinion, right? Yaakov is in Mitzrayim, right? And you can see that when he first comes, he is honored greatly by Paro and Mitzrayim. At the time, even when he was passing, it was Avel Mitzrayim. It was a mourning to Mitzrayim, right? They saw the bracha that came from him, or they saw what a righteous person he was, and the retinue that accompanied him to burial in Eretz Israel was incredible, right? So Yaakov did bring blessing to his host country. Had his righteous nature rubbed off on them, his blessing would indeed have remained. However, neither Egypt nor Paro, obviously, were influenced by Yaakov's ethical attributes and his faith in a supreme, just God who guides men's behavior and who does not tolerate oppression. Doesn't take much to understand that it did not rub on them. Therefore, when Yaakov dies, according to Rabbi Yossi, the blessing is gone. You deserve it, you can keep it. Right? And this question, I just want to elaborate in general, this question about what makes goodness in this world permanent is a question that's not new just to this parsha and Yaakov's blessing. And we could see it that it motivates even the way that the Kadosh Baruch Hu himself deals with us. I want to give you some examples that you could just pick out, I'm sure, on your own, some others. First of all, there's a mitzvah that we all should learn Torah, and that we should teach and train our children in the ways of the Torah, right? Two mitzvot, really. Lilmod ulelamed, right? So the Rambam brings these mitzvot in Yad HaChazaka, and he begins the review of the laws of Torah learning, and each of us, first he says, is commanded to learn, right? And he quotes a proof for that, and he says, "Ulemadatem, v'lemadatem otam, ushmartem la'asotam," from Dvarim. Learn so that you do, right? And perform the mitzvah. On the other hand, the other mitzvah, to teach one's children, to support that, he brings the pasuk, "V'limadatem otam et bnechem ledaber ba." With a siddur, I'm sure you don't even need the siddur. Where does that come from? V'limadatem Kriya Shema. What part of Kriya Shema?
Yes.
People who sat far away are probably going to be better to ask them. What part of Kriya Shema? Vayayim Shema, the second paragraph of the Kriya Shema, right? Now that's a little peculiar, right? Because there's a pasuk in the first paragraph of Kriya Shema that says, "V'shinam tam levanecha v'dibarta bam," right? Now the question comes up, why not quote the first parsha as, "You shall speak them into your children," right? V'dibarta bam, and speak to them again and again of the Torah. Why not? Obviously, levanecha, right? To your children. So it so happens that that pasuk is mentioned in the Gemara, which the Rambam knows very well. The Gemara in Kedushin quotes that pasuk to say that you and I should learn, and learn in a certain way. That we should learn in such a way that it should be so ingrained and imbued into our mouths again and again and again, and reviewed and understood so well that it'll become really second nature to us, and we can hear and answer any challenges that are presented to us, but not the pasuk to teach the children. It appears to be you learn, and you learn out loud, and you repeat the learning, and your children are around, and they hear you, and you do that all the time. whether you're walking in the way and you're driving to a job, and the children are with you when you're going shopping, you speak of the Torah, and you speak of the Torah again, again, and again, over and over. V'dibarta bam, you speak them. What is about the second pasuk in the second paragraph that's preferable? It seems to me that that is a very important notion about what chinuch and what education is. What happens in the second paragraph is the following. I want you to teach your children, right? But first, I want you to remember what I have just now said, the Kadosh Baruch Hu is saying about the consequence to behavior, good and bad, right? I want you to internalize this yourself. And the pasuk is, skip the page. V'samtem et dvarai ele al levavchem v'al nafshechem. Take these things that I have taught you, the Kadosh Baruch Hu says, you who was learning, and internalize it into your heart and into your very soul, right? After that, ukshartem lo'ot al yadchem v'ayulu totavot beinechem. Then you act in such a way that shows your commitment and your actualization in action. And then it says, unlike the first paragraph in which you speak in every way that you could and put on tefillin. There is no teaching after that. In this case, it's flipped around. The teaching is at the end of the paragraph. And before that, there is taking it to heart, which is not mentioned in the first paragraph, and acting and action. The tefillin comes before the teaching. So it appears that a child, we are taught, is going to be taught effectively when he sees the parent feel the feeling and walk the walk, right? And if you want to teach your children, it's not like the first paragraph, learning for yourself and repeating it in the presence of your children again and again. As much as being the kind of person who has incorporated the feeling and the understanding and the commitment internally yourself before you even come to teach, and acting out in such a way according to the living style of the Torah itself before your children, and then that will be the teaching. Lidaber bam, because the difference between that pasuk and the first pasuk is also you teach them to speak in it. Not lidaber bam, you speak, right? The first one is v'dibarta bam. You teach and you teach and you speak. They heard you say shas, right? They heard you say the parsha. In this case, you have done the kind of demonstration of your inner commitment and your action in such a way that they will be the ones who learn to speak of the things and teach others, right? And that's the kind of Talmud Torah, of Limud Torah, that the Kedushin, the Masechet Kedushin and the Rambam are using as the text to support the mitzvah of to teach, because that is teaching. Teaching is not repeating something that the child is going to be able to memorize, but teaching is something that you demonstrate, that he himself then will be able to incorporate himself, right? So in the first paragraph, Shinantam comes first, and V'limadetem et mechem comes last in the second paragraph. A child internalizes his teaching when he hears the ideals and thoughts expressed by his parents, but he must also see them in action as a way of life of the family and community. I want to point out a couple of things on that paragraph as well, is that there is a transformation between the first and the second paragraph. The first one is spoken in the singular, V'havta, Shinantam, speaking to one person. And the second one that talks about training our children, it's plural. V'limadetem, right? And so on and so on. It's plural. The entire paragraph is plural. And it appears maybe that we're trying to say is that real true education and chinuch will also come as a result of being surrounded by the kind of people we're talking about as part of a family, as part of a kehillah, as part of a people. That it takes, how is it that Hillary Clinton,
Takes a village.
Alei Shalom said,
Why
it takes a village to
She's
it
still
takes a
alive.
village to train a child, right? It's a communal responsibility. It's a family responsibility. It's not just a single person. Okay. It also is interesting that the second paragraph is the first time that we have a consequence mentioned. We have the whole paragraph, and so on and so on. Right? Meaning that true education will outlast the person who's teaching. You will be able to transform your children to be like you, to deserve the consequences of your chinuch, right? The other one is you. When you're gone, that will be the end of it. But in this case, the Torah is trying to say that once you succeed in the first paragraph's dictum of education, then that will bring consequences that will outlive you. And of course, that brings to mind my father. Ora remembers, just yesterday I was talking to her about the yahrzeit coming up. And she said, she's an Asesor, and she said she constantly brings an image, comes to her mind when she's about to start davening, of the picture, of the actual concrete picture of my father standing in front of the wall where he was davening, still, totally, it was obvious that he was totally enveloped in his tefillah, and that has remained in him since she was a child. She says that has remained with her, that every time she davens, that picture comes to her mind. Picture comes to her mind. He demonstrated in feeling and in action, in a very quiet way, that kind of demonstration, that kind of chinuch, which then lives on after him. He's now passed away, and Ora is davening the way he davened. To say, what better example of a successful limud? Hashem himself, I wanted to illustrate in the tefillah and in the siddur, Hashem himself takes this kind of approach with us. If you look at the Kriyas Shema, the last paragraph, you don't have to go very far to find examples like this. Here we have the first two paragraphs, now the third paragraph from the Kriyas Shema. There's something redundant, seemingly redundant and repetitious. Look at the tzitzit, uritem u'zachartem et kol mitzvotai asher anochi metzaveh etchem hayom ve'lo tatur achrei levavchem v'achrei einechem asher atem zonim achreiha. Right? The first awareness of zachartem, by being reminded of God's commandments, and it will train us to obey them, and to avoid the temptations that we're so prone to, of corruption and evil, right? So we've achieved something that the mitzvah is supposed to achieve, right? But then the very next statement says, which is obviously seems like a repetition, but it's not. Right? Doing the mitzvot and remembering the mitzvot and following the mitzvot is not the ultimate internalization of the kind of person that you are trying to become in this life. According to many, this is actually a mitzvah that cannot be performed. It's a goal, it's an effort. Try to become holy, right? And that means, according to the Chovos Halevavos, he once asked, how come Gan Eden is not mentioned in the Torah? Yeah, a lot of rewards we get. And if the biggest reward we have is Tchiyat HaMeitim and Olam Haba, why isn't it there specifically said? So he says, well, people don't understand that you don't get Olam Haba for doing the mitzvos in the Torah and for not doing the averos in the Torah. He got himself into trouble with that. You know, if you ask Yeshiva Bracham, they don't study Chovos Halevavos. It's sort of considered a bit radical, but he felt that the Torah was given letzaref b'hem et habriot. Torah was given to do all those things to avoid corruption, lo tatur rachel lachem rachenechem, in order that you will then become a different person, right? In terms of internalization, the actual acting is not sufficient without transcending to another level, right? So that's one example where the Kadosh Baruch Hu is actually demanding that we take it within, right? There's another bracha, not too much farther, at the end of Shmoneh Esrei, we have Sim Shalom. And that also seems redundant. Sim Shalom, Tova, Bracha, Chaim, B'chesed, Rachamim, Aleinu, Al Kol Yisrael, Amecha. That sounds like a lot. Put all those things upon us. Can't ask for more. Then it says, Barcheinu avinu kulanu ke'echad be'or panecha ki be'or panecha natata lanu. Those things which we asked before seem shalom, right? Natata lanu Torat chayim, avat chesed, tzedakah, bracha, brachamim, v'chayim, v'shalom. Right? So what's being said with those two halves of that bracha? So I think what's important there is, the first one is put. Take shalom. Try to take this kind of, kaviyachol, put peace. We have a lot of milchama, we have a lot of quarrel. Hashem, make us peaceful. Make it good, right? And peace is first, all done. And you notice there that there's no real relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu much. We say sim shalom without saying Avinu, without saying Elokeinu. There's no name of the Kadosh Baruch Hu there. Put this all upon us. We'll be passive receiving. What the Kadosh Baruch Hu created in this world, we need it, right? Then we say, no, that's not quite enough. Again, we're transcending to a different level. Barcheinu is not the same as sim. When you bless somebody, you bless your children in the morning. Yisimcha Hashem Elokeinu, right? What you say, you cannot control what they're going to be. You wish upon them that they will be, right? So Barcheinu Hashem, Avinu, Kulanu Ke'echad, Be'or Panecha, with the light of your face through a revelation, not just put it there, right? The revelation of your face, because with that revelation of your face, you gave us a Torah, Torat Chaim. A Torat Chaim. And what did that Torat Chaim do for us? That Torah has trained us to be the kind of person who loves chesed and rachamim and tzedakah. We become the kind of person who then achieves, finally, shalom. Shalom is the last in the second half. In the first half, we need peace. Give us peace, please. Right? But the second half is make us the kind of person we understand that if we only took to heart what it is that the Kadosh Baruch Hu has given us with Torat Chaim, we would end up loving so much those qualities which finally will bring about shalom. So you see that this is the same kind of theme, right? Taking the basic requirement that we have and becoming transformed to be able to actually to create the bracha that we, right? Yaakov Avinu gave them a bracha. They had to be the ones who would be able to achieve the perpetuation of the bracha in Mitzrayim. You don't do it, you don't do it. You don't have it. Chinuch requires that. And the tefillos demonstrate it. So I'm reminded that my Abba raised wonderful children, at least 2 out of the 3, and grandchildren with beautiful Jewish hearts, full of kindness and ahavat abriot. And it was his gentleness and his attitude that the loving nature is a visible trait carried on in his children after him. Abba's love of Eretz Yisrael was demonstrated in his life, the way he grew up and what he did in arriving at Eretz Yisrael, and the teaching that he did to everyone that he touched about Eretz Yisrael and its importance. And his grandchildren are there, his great-grandchildren are there, and most of his kids, except the Rabim, are there, except for me. There was an example I want to tell you about. One granddaughter had gotten married and within about a year was going on Aliyah. And she came to say goodbye to my father and mother in the house that they were living across the street. And she was torn up, excited about going to Israel, but seeing my Saba, and he was already older and frail. And she felt like she may never see him again. So she tried to say goodbye and she couldn't bring the words out and she started crying. So straightens himself up. Ahuva, don't you know what you're about to do? It's the most beautiful, the most wonderful. I'm crying now. He praised her to the sky and tried to inspire her about the kind of steps that she was taking and how proud, and this was part of him moving forward to be there. And she stifled her tears. Her husband tried to cheer her up, and that was the way they said goodbye. I mean, that's the kind of things that he was able to transmit. And he raised children who loved to learn, loved to learn Torah. His love of Torah, which really was what he was all about. I mean, he was either learning or teaching. That's all he was ever doing. I never played ball with him. It was made Torah our own. And even in times of stress, I can think of my sisters, and stress and hardship, we are sustained by a deep pleasure in Torah learning, not just obligation, but pleasure, excitement of learning. And there are two segments of the Brachos HaTorah that we say in the morning. Again, if you want to look at that, we say, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kitshanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We make a bracha. We understand our obligation to harava, to expend effort in the learning of Torah. And then there's a second bakasha, harevna, Hashem Elokeinu, right? Make it sweet, please, Kadosh Baruch Hu, in our mouths. Not only in our mouths, but in the children's mouths and in our grandchildren's mouths, right? Baruch atah Hashem, melamed Torah l'amo Yisrael. I mean, this is the epitome of what I've been saying, right? He gave us the Torah, but a true teacher is the one who makes Torah sweet, delicious to his students, so that they continue to desire it, not just to perform, right? I think that's the Rav Soloveitchik had once pointed it out. That the Kadosh Baruch Hu is a notena Torah, but he's a real melamed when he makes the Torah delicious, right, and tasty in our mouths. So the Torah considers that a teacher's student is like his child. So Abba gave birth to thousands of children. I mean, a couple of them are here, right? And mother of one of them is here, at least, if I'm not mistaken.
Me.
What's that?
My daughter was this.
Your daughter and
My daughter.
your daughter. And so his impact
And
on...
two of my children have made Aliyah already, so.
That's, I mean, they're infected, that's right. The seeds were sown. So his impact is really voluminous. I mean, I meet people whose grandchildren were his students, and it just goes on and on. So the ripple effect is incredible, and it's visible everywhere. And what kind of a teacher was he? So you have to ask a couple of the people who can testify to it. But I remember testimonials of the students that one thing that was expected of them is that they come into a shiur and they had to know basically the material that was going to be discussed in the shiur. You didn't come in to learn what Rashi said and to go through the psukim. You had to do what you had to do. And that frightened them a little bit because it was expected. Is that right? And because what was supposed to happen in the shiur was that there was supposed to be some analysis and some discussion and some elaboration so that something new might be produced. I remember when he was marking his exams at the end of a semester. I may have told you the story before. At the end of a semester, there was always a time limit for the exams were taken, and within about 4 days, you had to bring in the grades to the principal's office. So he used to give essays exams. You had to write. And he would stand on a stender. He had this little stender in the corner, and he would not want to fall asleep, so he stood there through the night, marking papers, and not just marking papers. You remember the papers? There were individual comments on the sides. This is what I think, and this is what you do. And I saw how exhausted he was. So as I got a little older, I had a little rachmanos on my father. I said, Abba, why don't you do what all the other teachers do? Give him multiple choice exams, fill in the blank exams. You know, you can make it much easier for you to mark those exams. He says, you don't understand. I am not interested in knowing whether they remember what I said. I'm interested in knowing whether they have learned to think. That's the kind of a teacher he was. So he sacrificed himself in this way. He never gave multiple choice exams. I don't think it ever happened. I remember the approach of Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkonos. If you remember, Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkonos was the one who never forgot a thing. Never forgot a thing. And his power was tremendous because he had the Masorah. If you wanted to ask him what Moshe Rabbeinu said to who, and after that, he would be the one. But his approach to halachic thinking, to discussion in the Beis Midrash, basically was all you had to do is figure out who remembered exactly what took place. Then you'd have it. You'd have it because the Torah was given in Sinai, and all you have to do is find out how it was given. He got into trouble with that, as a matter of fact, because he pushed that to the limit, to the point where the Beis Midrash was trying to discuss, and there was a machlokas about it, and he says, I know. I know, there's no point in you discussing things. Why don't you just ask me, because I know, right? And he got into trouble with it. So he was away from the Beit Midrash. People used to come to visit him among the Chachamim, and he would say, who was telling a shiur today? So once one of them said something about the original that one of the people in the yeshiva had said. And the Gemara discusses, obviously an apocryphal idea. He took his eyes out. You remember the story? Took his eyes out. And the man was blinded. And the students stood there, changed their minds, and they said, "Mimeimecha anachnu shotim." We actually purely own our drinking from what you have said. You're the origin of everything. He gave him back his eyes. But they had learned from that you don't fool around with chidushim, with him, Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanos. Unlike Rabbi Yeshua, who was a contemporary, Rabbi Yeshua was also older and away from the Beit Midrash, and students, so I think the same ones, came to visit him. And he said to them, what was new in the Beit Midrash today? So they remembered the last experiences. I'm not going to go there. So they said, "Mimeimecha anachnu shotim." You know, I mean, you're the one who gave us everything, so whatever we do is just rehashing what you said. He said, A'i efshar lebeit hamidrash shelo yeh bo davar chadash b'chol yom. That wasn't his approach. Torah is living, moving, developing. Don't tell me you're drinking from my drink, from my waters, right? Again, this internalization coming up with something that is your own. That's the kind of teacher he was. And therefore, his influence surely has amazing ripples and blessing worldwide. And we can be certain that they continue to be in this world even long after he's gone. Examples of the people that we know, I mean, who have been his students and at least some of his children. So what was his reward? What is Abba's reward? How do you gauge what a reward is? So I'm sure he's embarrassed by speaking, but what is Abba's reward? So in order to answer that question, I came up with a ridiculous, you might think this is a ridiculous idea, but I'm excited about it. Abraham, you'll probably like it, but you'll knock it down as well. So I remember another Abraham, right? Abraham Avinu. He's Abraham Avi. We're talking about Abraham Avinu. So in Bereshis, Yud Gimel and Yud Daled, Abraham and Sarah had brought their nephew Lot with them to the promised land, along with Hanefesh Asher Asu B'Charan. Many people they influenced and converted and brought close to the Kadosh Baruch Hu, right? We don't hear much about the future of those many souls. And people talk about that, right? Makara la Nefesh Asher Asu B'Charan, if they're Nefesh Asu. All right, but Lot was still with them. They go down to Mitzrayim during the famine. They come back after a lot of troubles, laden down with riches and many, many flocks. And Lot's shepherds and Abraham's shepherds have a little bit of a quarrel, right? There's not enough grazing land. Whose grazing land you should go to? People have all kinds of discussions about what it was, but they couldn't get along. So Abraham at this point, goes to Lot, and he says to Lot, let's not quarrel. Why don't you choose where you want to go? And I'll go the opposite way. So we won't have a fight. According to the Medrash, the Kadosh Baruch Hu comes to him. We don't see that in the text. Kadosh Baruch Hu comes to him. Everyone that you meet, you can attract. Everyone that you meet, you can influence. And your own flesh and blood, you have to send away. It's quite a reprimand. He's the uncle, right? The nephew of his brother that passed away in Haran. He said, I want to tell you, the Kadosh Baruch Hu says, that you and your children will not ever be redeemed until there's going to be a reunification with Lot. You know that? And it so happens, you know, the mysterious way in which this happened, right? Lot, in an amazing way, has a child with one of his daughters, who's Moab. Moab, many generations later, has Ruth. Ruth, the Moabiyah, converts. Comes and marries Boaz, who's a Gadol Israel. They marry. They create a child who is the ancestor of David HaMelech, who is the ancestor, if not the Mashiach himself, right? And so Abraham Avinu and Lot have to come together. And Abraham, I think, remembers this reprimand. He doesn't know what to do. Lot is gone. How am I going to do this? So, as luck would have it, there's a war. And there are kings come to Sodom, and they conquer Sodom, where Lot is. Lot went there because it was the most fertile, rich place around in those days. It's hard to know that Sodom could be that way, right? But so these kings come, and they take the entire city's possessions and all the people away. Abraham, the uncle, hears that this has happened. Says, got to do something about this. He gets a bunch of people together with him, some allies, and he runs after those captors, and he frees all of the captured people and the possessions, and he leads them back to Sodom. Comes to Sodom, Melchizedek comes out and gives him a blessing, and a blessing of the Kodesh Baruch Hu, and the king comes out and he says, anything you want, take the entire wealth, and just give me the people. Abraham says, no, I don't want to take anything that anybody should say. Kodesh Baruch Hu had enriched Abraham. And all I want is my allies who had some expenses, reimburse them. And the chapter ends by saying the following. And Abraham returned all the possessions and Lot and his possessions and the women and the possessions. It's like a shopping list that he brought back. End of chapter. Nothing. No discussion is had between Lot and Abraham. No discussion back. Lot clearly does not come back with him. So I think something special happened at that point. The chapter ends in silence. The very, very next pasuk in the next chapter, next parak, Kodesh Baruch Hu comes to Abraham in a machazeh. And he says to him, Al tira Abraham, Ani magen lach, I am your shield, uscharcha harbe meod, and your reward is very great. It's not clear what he was afraid of, and it's not clear what he has to be rewarded for. I mean, is it a reward for the war? What is he afraid of? So I have a feeling, this is my own craziness, I have a feeling that something happened during that chapter that we just finished reading. Abraham remembers the Kodesh Baruch Hu's reprimand. He runs after this old uncle, runs after Lot, who is his only surviving relative. And he saves his life. And he thinks, this is going to be the time. We're going to see each other. We're going to fall on each other's neck. Where have you been? I'm so happy that you saved me. I'm so happy that I have you with me again. And you would have them talk to each other. They'd walk arm in arm back to Sodom. And of course, Lot would take his family and come back to his uncle because, I've missed you. Silence, total silence, to the point where he's returning to Sodom like a package deal with all the things that were there. He's not his nephew. He's not his nephew. So Abraham says to the Kodesh Baruch Hu, his response, Charcha harbe meod, he says, Mati tenli, Kodesh Baruch Hu, what can you give me? V'ani olech hariri, and I am bereft. I'm a wasteland. I remembered your reprimand. I'm putting those words into Abraham's mouth. I remembered your reprimand. I was waiting for an opportunity. I thought I could save him and that would bring us together again. And I see that I've lost him completely. He didn't even look at me. He didn't pass one word with me. And he didn't come back with me. And here I am with no one. Who am I going to pass anything on to? Eze sachar. What kind of sachar are you going to give me? Mati tenli. Loda tatali zera. You didn't give me any children. I thought I might have a nephew. I thought I'd have one of the nefashot asher asiti, right? But I have nothing. So I know, Kodesh Baruch Hu, that the only thing I ever wanted in life is to be able to live up to the promise that you told me when you said Lech Lecha, Escha legoy gadol, and you heyei bracha, and nivrechu b'cha kol mishpachot ha'adama. I'm going to bring a blessing to everyone, and I'm going to have children who will bring a blessing to everyone. You know that that's what I want. So what reward can you give me if I don't have that? I'm destroyed. Kodesh Baruch Hu knows very well what motivates Abraham. And he said, no, you don't understand. When I said Schachar Be'miot, I know the Schachar that you live for. It's not riches and it's not health and it's not long life. It is exactly what you said. And I want to promise you, you will have a child. That which you want as the reward that is greatest, because you want to give over something that will continue after you, you're going to have it. You're going to have it. You lost Lot, but you're going to have it. I think that's the dialogue, because the dialogue is otherwise very hard to understand. The reward that Abraham gets is mentioned again in the time when, not too long afterwards, Hashem wants to destroy Sodom, right? And he says, am I not going to talk to Abraham about this? Who says he has to tell me, he has to tell Abraham when an earthquake is going to be in Japan? I mean, but he's the one who saved Sodom. And the Maharal in Prague says that when you save somebody, he becomes like your child. And you can never, you to pick up a person in the street, he's one of the homeless, 100 homeless. You take one and you feed him and you whatever, and then he leaves you. You're always going to think, I wonder how that Yankel is doing. Connection. So Avram's got to know something about Sodom, because he's going to feel pain if Sodom is gone, right? So he's got to talk to him about it. So he says, and why do I have to talk to him about it? Because there's a pasuk that's very important. Ki dativ, I know that I have chosen Abraham, asher yitzaveh et banav, because I know what makes him tick. He is the one who's going to teach his children. Ve'et beito acharav, and his family after he's gone, right? V'shamru derech Hashem, and they will be the ones who will carry on the shmirat Hashem, lasot tzedakah u'mishpat. Why? Lema'an havi Hashem al Abraham et asher diber alav. He's going to do this because that's all he ever wanted, was to see that there will be children and children's children after him that will do that which he will teach them. Lasot lalechet b'derech Hashem lasot tzedakah u'mishpat. In order that the bracha and the reward will not come to the children. We're talking about that will be his reward. That's all that he ever lived for. And that, lahavi al Abraham, et asher diber alav, Hashem diber alav, right? And because when he lives for that, there is no other reward except the awareness that he has achieved that. And I think if you want to ask what Abraham's reward, sachar char be'meod, is that sachar. Leman havi al Abraham, Hashem al Abraham, et asher diber alav. And I think as far as my father was concerned, he ate food because my mother cooked. And he went and traveled and enjoyed Switzerland because my mother said we've got to go. And if he had his way, he would sit and he would think about the Kadosh Baruch Hu, and he would learn and he would teach and he would be gentle and he would see his children and he would walk to shul. I mean, what he wanted was zachar harbei meod, is that zachar. That's something, I think, when he looks down and in Yitzhak Hashem, his children and his progeny follow in the ways that he wanted them to go, he's rewarded. Because that's all he ever wanted. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
That's very beautiful said.
Yeah.
Definitely.
He does. See it. Kids.